Hi, today I'm going to show the before and after of the installation of a bulletproof oil cooler kit. What Bulletproof has developed this time is they've found a way, or developed a way here, to take a factory oil cooler, which has also been redesigned a few years ago, but they're relocating it out of the center of the block over behind the passenger side battery. Yes, they have an oil cooler relocation kit already developed, but this is an updated one where they take the updated factory oil cooler and install it over here on the passenger side, behind the passenger side battery, with the hoses and the water lines to run it. I already have one video showing doing a complete factory oil cooler install with the Bulletproof EGR cooler, and that one's about an hour and a half long. So on this video I'm not going to bore you with all the details showing how to get the intake and the turbo and all that off. If you need to see that, just look at the other video. On this one I'm going to go over all the highlights showing the oil cooler install with the relocation kit, and also the afterwards of the temperatures, because this truck here, it's a perfect candidate. He's had it since 2006, but he's had 3 EGR coolers fail on him, and he's pretty much frustrated with the 6.0. It's not so much the 6.0's fault as it is somebody's not fixing the truck right. So now I've got a hold of it. We're going to go ahead and get the water flowing through the EGR cooler properly, make sure he doesn't have any coolant leaks, and see if he can actually start enjoying this truck. So you see here's most of the parts minus the hoses. That's the part there in the center where we're going to be mounting it on the block to where the oil and the water can go by. Then here's your factory oil cooler with the adapter that we're going to use to run the water and the oil through. A Bulletproof EGR cooler, which has already been proven out for years and done well for us. Then also the mounting piece here that we're going to use behind the battery to mount the oil cooler on. So I'm going to go ahead and get this one apart and start showing the highlights. One thing I like to strongly recommend is anytime you're into this engine, and especially if you're not sure, let's do the updates while you're there. The stuff such as the standpipes, the dummy plugs, the good time to replace the IPR screen, and even the high pressure pump coupler. Because once you do these and you fix all the known problems with these 6.0s, they're actually not a bad engine. So if you're going this far into it and you're doing these updates, let's just go a little bit further and do this now while you have the engine mostly torn down. These parts are also, you can get them right from Bulletproof. They sell a kit with this updated turbo drain back tube and that oil feed pipe. You can get all of it at the same time while you're getting the oil cooler kit. A couple of pointers I like to give here. Before you remove any of this, make sure you cover your intake ports up here. I have the turbo drain back tube down inside here that keeps all the dirt from going back inside there when I blow it out. And then before you lift the oil cooler off, 2 things. One, scrape it all off along here before you blow it out. Get all the dirt out of here, because cleanliness is really important. Just remember everything here, your IPR screen here, the size of it compared to a penny, all your oil passes through there. And if you get any dirt in there, just like less than a teaspoonful, you're going to be doing this IPR screen multiple times. It may be 5 miles, it may be 1,000 miles, but you get any dirt inside there, it's going to happen. Also, if you're going to be doing the STC fitting, replacing it here with this fixed one, do it first, because when you take the high pressure pump off, all the oil drains back out of the oil cooler. Makes the oil cooler cavity a lot less messy. So if you're doing the coupler at the same time, go ahead and do it first. Okay, we have the intake off of this, everything torn down, oil cooler removed, screen removed. We're not going to be installing a screen back in the block. The Bulletproof kit comes with a new screen on the bottom of it, which we'll show here in a second. This is their base that we're going to be installing on the block. First thing we're going to do is install an original equipment gasket onto the seal onto the oil cooler, and also this is the screen that I'm talking about that this here will filter all the different contaminants inside the oil, so that's why we don't have to worry about the one that's inside the block. Make sure you're completely clean inside of here. You don't want any type of dirt. Less than a teaspoon of dirt will cause your IPR valve screen to fail multiple times. Also make sure that you're clean around the block here, so you have a good sealing thing, and also make sure all your bolt holes are blown out so you don't get a false torque from hydraulicking by putting the bolts back in there with oil inside there. We're going to put the cover back on using all the original bolts. Okay, on the oil filter base, we're going to get it all cleaned up here so we make sure that it's all good, we don't have any problems with it. Then we're going to take some assembly lube and install put a little bit here inside the grooves to hold the gasket for you. I usually like to just put it in every place, maybe every 2 or 3 inches, that way my gasket doesn't come out. Then we're going to install the seals on here. The seals installed on both parts here of the oil filter base. Now, one thing I want to point out that's pretty serious, it's pretty important. They supply you with a kit. They supply you with all the seals, hoses, gaskets, everything you need to put this on. On this, when you start to do the oil filter base here, there's 3 bolts that we're going to be using up here that we took out. We don't use the original ones on these here, the Torx 30, the smaller ones. Those we discard. So we're going to be using the ones supplied in the kit when we go to mount this back on. We reuse the 5 larger bolts, the 1 up front here, and the 4 in the back, and the 5 larger holes. And put them on. Up here, we're using the 3 bolts that Bulletproof supplies with it. They're shorter bolts, so we want to make sure that we use the proper one on here. These are also either 5 millimeters or 3/16 fits a little loose, but the 3/16 will work, or 5 millimeter. So let's go ahead and snug these up. I'm going to install the Bulletproof EGR cooler. Now, if at any time you feel that your bolts aren't lining up, or you're getting even the slightest bit of binding inside of there, just take a 5/16 drill bit, because there's a lot of meat inside the intake manifold. Just take a 5/16 drill bit. Open them both up a little bit and clean this all off. Of course, don't get any metal shavings around. But that, with the larger holes, it makes the installation of the coolers a lot better. Take the rear EGR cooler clamp, spread it way open, set it on inside of there. Just leave it sit back there. With the gasket held on in the rear by some high heat silicone, intake held in place by the bolts, EGR cooler mounted on there, we'll go ahead and set it inside there. Paying attention to lining up the back, the exhaust up pipe with the EGR cooler first, making sure my O-ring stays in place underneath the intake, setting it down there, and then making sure every bolt is started. Take the rear clamp, make sure it's in the right position, and latch your bolt on it. Position it straight up and down and tighten it up. Next step, we take the 90-degree hose and we install it over the water line on the EGR cooler. Bulletproof recommends, and they also supply you with the spring clamps. They keep a more constant tension. So I'm going to go ahead and take these install them on the hose here, then install the hose. A pointer that I can give you is make sure that the clamps, you have both big ends going out. As you see the position of the hose here, make sure the big end's going out. And also spray a little bit of WD-40 or some type of soap onto the hose to help it to move easier. With the clamps both positioned like this, if you can't push them around with your thumb, which is pretty hard, take your screwdriver and put it underneath here. Being careful, do not pry against that, that just spreads it. Go off to the side and rotate it. Same way with both of them. Again, off to the side. Rotate them. It's important that you have these below the pedestal mounting bracket, so we have to rotate them. And also what's important is that your hose is slid on past the nipple. If I squeeze it, I feel it right about here. You can see with the hose clamps in the proper position, we don't have a problem with the hose now. You should be looking about like this with the pedestal and the oil cooler adapter and top cover mounted on the oil cooler. I'm going to go ahead and install the wire loom. If you have any questions on where to install the wire loom or connect it, please refer to my earlier video where I show it exactly step by step. This one I'm just trying to show the highlights of the remote mounted oil cooler. Take the shorter hose and install it on the nipple on the passenger's side. It takes an 1¼ inch wrench, or you can actually use a 10-inch adjustable wrench. I'll take the hose and I'll twist it to help me out to get it to tighten up the lower nut, and then I'll rotate it until I have it to where it's taking the natural arch, bending that way. And then here with my wrench, I'll get the last little bit out of it and snug it up. Now we have that hose on. The next step is to install the turbo. You may want to check it before you do and see if it needs the unison ring either replaced or cleaned. If you have any questions on how to take the turbo apart and do it, Google search or YouTube search my P0299 video. It shows in depth on how to take the turbo apart, clean it, inspect it, the unison ring, and also make sure it's put back together properly. Your engine should basically look like this. You have the wire loom on, intake, turbo drain back, one oil hose, and one coolant hose. I'm going to go ahead and set the turbo on. With the turbo installed, it's time to put on the second heater hose. I install the clamp on the hose first, then set it inside of there. If you feel like you need some type of lubricant, I'll use a soap like a 409 or Fantastic or something. A couple of pointers. Make sure that your hose starts off being square. You need all the room on this nipple that you can get. Make sure it's all the way seated down, and also that the clamp is in the proper position. Take a couple minutes and make sure this is right, because you don't want to do this twice. So here I have this one, and coming from the driver's side, you can look down and see the actual position of the clamp and the hose. So it's looking pretty good. Just take a few minutes and make sure it's right, that you're on the nipple, it's all the way seated, and the clamp is square. Install the second oil hose. And this one, it gets routed behind the oil line, the oil feed line to the turbo. So feed it down through here. Get it started. And make sure it's all your lines, your oil and your coolant lines, are laying towards the passenger side. So let's go ahead and snug that up. Whenever you're doing a flared fitting seal, try to make sure the best that you can that you get this centered before you snug it up. That way you have the optimum amount of surface area to be crimped or tightened down. I'm not using any fancy tools, even though a wrench would be handier. I'm just using a crescent wrench, and with the wrench, just using it and flipping it here back and forth, I'm able to tighten this and get the proper torque, get this tightened down. The remote oil cooler is going to be mounted over here right behind the passenger battery tray. So we're going to remove the vacuum reservoir and the battery tray for right now. In the kit they supply a different vacuum reservoir That way you don't have any issues with your four-wheel drive or your blend door motor inside the truck. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these. To get the vacuum reservoir off, the 3 bolts are mounted underneath the fender well liner. We're going to remove the 3 bolts here to get the vacuum reservoir out. Place the relocation bracket down inside where you just removed the battery tray. Reinstall the battery tray. Get it all routed properly and snug it up. A helpful tip here, before you install your battery tray, this is going to be on the outside of your relocation bracket, so you need to compensate for the thickness of that relocation bracket. I just take the tray here and just give it a little bit of adjustment. That way I bring this inside a little bit, and it makes these bolt holes here line up a lot better. I also removed the captive nuts that were here, and I'm going to just reach underneath and put a nut and washer on the bottom. Makes it a lot easier versus trying to find it and start it that way. That's just my preference. I snugged the bolts up against the fender first, and it helps to make it over here to line a lot easier to stick the bolts straight through. Reach underneath with a nut and washer. With the relocation bracket installed, we're going to put a factory original oil cooler onto the mount here for the oil and the water supply lines. You only use the top 2 O-rings on the cooler, and you also put the supplied O-rings on the bottom here. I put some assembly lube to hold it, and also to lubricate inside here to ease in putting it together. So now with the O-rings on there and also in here, we'll just press it together. Now it's together, and we just use the factory bolts that we took out to assemble it, to finish tightening it down. With the oil cooler installed, you want to set the whole assembly down inside the relocation bracket, and using the 4 bolts that Bulletproof supplies with the lock washer and the flat washer, install it into all the different mounting holes here on the bracket and snug it up. With the oil cooler installed, your engine should basically look like this. Before I cut the hose or do any of the routing, I want to reassemble the engine, because you know that old saying that if it's better to measure twice and cut once. I don't want to have to go and have to replace a hose or go try to find a special hose to get on here. So I'm going to reassemble the engine, put the fan and the alternator and all the stuff back on, then go over the hose routing. But what I will mention, the front hose, the one that's to the right there by the cooler, also goes on the front of the oil on the relocation bracket over there. And the same way, just the opposite, the one that's going from the EGR cooler back here, the 90-degree one we took off the EGR cooler, is going to go on the rear of the oil cooler. And then the oil ones are basically self-explanatory because they only reach one way, where you have the closest one from the cooler or from the relocation also goes to the closest to the cooler here, in the same way the further to the further. So I'm going to go ahead and reassemble the engine before we try to do the routing on that, just to make sure we have the clearance proper around the alternator, around the charge air cooler tubing and hoses there. So I'm going to reassemble it and come right back. I'm trying to only cover the highlights on this video where it differs from doing just a basic oil cooler install. I have the one video on the EGR cooler, oil cooler installs, that shows everything, every last nut, bolt, clip, what to do to replace your oil cooler. On this one, again, just the highlights, but I wanted to stop and mention that I do reuse the seals on here over and over. Just make sure that they are there and you won't have a problem. In the same way with the washers on the back, I reuse them here on this line. And the pointer I want to give is I get everything started before I tighten it down. That way, while it's still loose, we can go ahead and move this around, manipulate it, and do what it takes to get these all started easily. Okay, we have it all back together except for the lines here. So what we do, again, the oil lines are pretty much self-explanatory. They only fit one way. Bulletproof has it in their instructions, everything's behind here, and it actually does fit pretty clean. So we'll take the one here that's off the front of the oil cooler. We can run it behind the charge air cooler hose and route it in here. Get that one started. And we have the second one here, same way, it's going to fit behind here. It's a little bit longer, but it does clear your AC lines and goes in. Then the one off the EGR cooler, it's going to go to the back one over here. So I have to cut it a little bit, but it'll go in through here. And the same way, the one that's on the front of the oil cooler, the relocation plate, we're going to put underneath here. So these will need a little bit of trim before we route them. So I'm going to clean it up a little bit here and tighten them up, but pretty much you can see the configuration of how we're going to do it. Before I snug it down, I'm going to make sure I have the oil cap and everything good. Put the clamps onto the hose first. Just spray a little bit of 409 here. Just give you something to slide it on. The hose will go on just like it has eyes. With the keys out of the ignition, right here in front of me, so I know they're out, I'll disconnect the starter wire over here. Take it, jump the starter. We're going to prime it to aid this to make it start up a little quicker once we get it all primed. I'm going to do that a couple more times, but I'm going to let the starter cool off for a second. This time I'm going to install the oil filter and crank it again for another 15-20 seconds to force it through the lines. One of the final steps before road testing it, since we removed the old vacuum reservoir, this large bulky one, in the kit they supply you with a smaller one here. We're going to mount it on the fender well here, on the inside here. They supply us the bolts, the vacuum, everything you need to do it. So I'll install this, then go out and drive it and get us some numbers. Here's the overall appearance of it once done. You can see the lines. Make sure as you do this too that you get your hose location, hose clamp location good. Make sure that you don't have any issues. Same way under here. Make sure that you don't have any contacts with sharp edges. Hose clamps on top of the cack hose good. But other than that, the clearance is actually pretty good. The hoses don't seem to be too much in the way. If you ever need an oil cooler again, which most likely will never fail, but it sure would be easy to change like this. And even if you have to get in the valve cover here, this comes off pretty easily. They just unscrew here. You can put the line straight up and work on it that way. So let's get the vacuum reservoir on and drive this. To replace the old vacuum reservoir, they supply you with a new vacuum ball here, and it comes with the needed vacuum lines to adapt it over, the ball, and the mounting hardware. So to start off, we'll put the captive nut back here in the far hole. We'll just slide it in. What I like to do just to get a measurement, I'll get the bolts started so we know where to put it. Put the ball in, just slide it into place. Then we'll mark where we're going to put the other bolt at. I have to put it down here. I'm going to make a mark. I'm doing this with one hand while holding the other camera. So I'm going to make a mark and then tap it. Okay, I made a mark there on it. Now we can remove this. That's the mark right there. So I'm going to use a self tapper and get the bolt started on that one. And in the meantime, remove this one. Once I've got the bolt tapped and started, we'll just run it up most of the way. I want to leave a big enough gap that I can slide the vacuum reservoir on, because this one's harder to get to, and then put the back one on. With the ball mounted, we're going to remove the vacuum line off the reservoir. So we'll take it off here. And then we're going to remove this piece right here with the two lines off of the red hose. We still need the T out of here. So we'll take this off. Okay, with this piece out of here, we're going to completely eliminate it. We'll take this supplied piece here that they gave us, the vacuum. The smaller end goes back down on the vacuum pump. The larger end goes in the larger hole of the vacuum ball. And then they also supplied us with another piece of vacuum tubing here. This one right here. We'll take this and we'll install this from the smaller hole down here on the ball to the T, to where we left the nipples still on there. So that's going to connect straight across here. This one down to the vacuum pump. So I'll go ahead and hook these up. And your final job at the end of this will look like how we have it here. So pretty much that should do your vacuum relocation. I've got done doing the cooling system flush on this one. It's about ready time to take it out, do a road test, and look at some temperatures. We've been driving it for about 20 minutes now. The highest that the oil temp has reached is 201, with the coolant temp peaked at 199. It's about 70, somewhere in the high 70s today. But the biggest difference that I've seen so far between the oil and the coolant is 6 degrees, and it's actually pretty much getting within 3 or 4 all the time.